So first of all, thank you, dear panelists. Thank you, the audience, for joining us for the webinar about non-kinetic means and non-kinetic operations. Today's topic is non-kinetic operations, how to defend your organization and society. The webinar is starting right now. I will maybe share my screen. Hope that everybody can see this. Yep. Yeah, here we go. Our topic for today is non-kinetic operations and how to defend organization society. It's obviously a big deal right now because in a modern world where there is, unfortunately for all of us, less and less security and more uncertainty, any kind of conflict, any kind of threat starts obviously not from the bullets, not from the airplanes flying, but typically from the non-kinetic means, from the information. And either we as society, each state or each organization, if it's a company, need to have a good visibility on building their own resilience. And each of us should know how to defend against ourselves and our teams, our closed ones, and obviously our countries. That's the goal for today, to bring some more clarity around this. And I'm happy to invite you to this webinar. The webinar is hosted by Osavul. Osavul is a tech company that provides software for information environment assessment to governments, businesses, society. We use technologies for actually identify and counter, protect from this kind of non-kinetic threats from adversaries. Osavul is a trusted partner by more than 15 partners worldwide, in all places all over the world. So we are happy to serve our friends and partners and allies to protect against non-kinetic threats. Today's agenda is basically understand the evolution of non-kinetic operations over the last few years, so see what's actually changing. We want to dive into the understanding and to identify the recipe of a successful non-kinetic operation. How does it look like, so we can spot it and understand better. Dive into some examples of successful and non-successful operations, and discuss tools, tactics, procedures for detecting and defending against threats. Overall, everything today is about the resilience. It's about bringing you some clarity to the audience, how to spot and counter these kind of efforts. Myself, Dmitry Bilash, will be your host today. I'm a co-founder and chief business development officer at Osavul. My experience mainly lies in AI-powered technologies and building tech for protecting our societies and our clients as well, essentially, against non-kinetic operations. And today I have two wonderful guests. The first guest is Jack. Jack is a leading voice in digital and cybersecurity leadership. He has a really huge experience across public and private sectors. Currently, he's a managing partner and Muse Sciences and serving as in several non-executive roles. So he actually helps to make this transformation and intersection between emerging tech, organizational change, and national security. Jack, when we talk about non-kinetic operation and defense, absolutely Jack is the right person to do this, because he is also a former Royal Marine officer and doctoral researcher in disruptive technologies. I think that Jack will bring today definitely an extremely valuable perspective, both from a defense world and a business world. So Jack, please, floor is yours. Give us a few words for your introduction.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me, and really excited to hopefully share some really useful perspectives on my experience both in the public and private sector dealing with non-kinetic operations, but also from a military perspective where we understand non-kinetic operations as part of a broader spectrum of effects that we can deliver in the battle space. And that is across cyber, electronic warfare, as well as what I would describe as information operations to shape and influence the behaviors of people fundamentally. So I'll pause it there for having a long intro, but thank you very much for having me. And Dmitry, pleasure to meet you and engage in this discussion.
Thank you so much. It's pleasure is mine. And I would like to present our second panelist today, who is Olga. Olga is a cognitive scientist and security expert focused on decision-making, strategic culture, and political warfare. So Olga, she is a project Europe director at the Irregular Warfare Initiative and visiting professor at the University of Bucharest. She's bringing, like a practical and scientific expertise to our conversation to help us actually understand how the non-kinetic operation looks like, how the irregular warfare actually implements in the real world, and how it may affect life of each of us. Olga, please give us a few words. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Dimitro, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. Definitely looking forward to sharing some best practices and some insights from the field with Jack and with yourself. And I think the main point that I wanted to start off was irregular warfare or non-kinetic operations or hybrid warfare or the information space in general. My personal take has always been that people and decision making depending on people, and now the intersection of people and AI are the core of absolutely everything. So I hope we'll hone in on that, and I look forward to joining in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that the very first question that I believe any from our attendees is going to have is where we are right now, because we see a lot of like anybody, even not an expert in irregular warfare, non-kinetic operation, in information operations, can spot that something happening in the world. Something is brewing, but it's not clear actually where we are and what are the tendencies, what are the trends and recent changes in non-kinetic operations over the last maybe a few years, especially starting from COVID. So maybe I will address the first question, Jack, to you. On the global scale, what trends do you see? Where we are right now, where we are going in terms of this kind of information, irregular warfare threats, and what each of us should pay attention to? Please share with us your perspective on the trends.
Sure. So what I would say is that there's like a series of contextual change drivers which have happened probably more broadly over the past 20 years, but it is only becoming increasingly significant. And most of this is around like geopolitical volatility being the new normal. We've obviously got increasing like economic interdependence, which presents opportunities and vulnerabilities. And this is aside from a national security perspective, but equally that is an incredibly important perspective. We've got technological disruption, and needless to say, the advent of accessible AI is changing the way in which we operate, both from a national security perspective, but also a business perspective. And there's this demand for, I suppose, leadership within this information non-kinetic effects space. Like, how do we effectively change the mindsets, attitudes, and beliefs, very much like a cultural component, but I'll let Olga talk on that a little bit more, of our adversaries so that we never need to take part in a fight. And what I think is so important on that particular train of thought is our ability to win a fight without ever firing a round is increasingly crucial. We're seeing that certain nation state actors have employed this really effectively as part of their national strategy. And I'd bring forth the idea of hybrid warfighting, is that using all the tools and national instruments or levers of power to achieve state aims. And within that, you've got these non-kinetic effects. And like I mentioned before, you've got cyber, you've got electronic warfare, and then you've got influence operations or information operations. And all of these are fundamentally designed to change mindsets, attitudes, and beliefs, but they're used across a very broad spectrum of audiences, whether they're partakers in a battle space, i.e. combatants, or they're individuals, civilians, going about their normal daily routine. I think it's so important to understand is that we're seeing the advent of discussions around TikTok and the exercising of state powers to change attitudes of young people. We're also seeing it in more specific ways, which is quite interesting, where you're getting targeted information attacks on people and the controlling of a narrative. But what I suppose the point I'm getting at here is that it's so difficult to understand or recognize when an information operation is happening, particularly at like nation state scale. So we've got to be aware of it all the time and almost doubt until verified. And we need to be very aware of validating where we're getting our information from, what information we're consuming, and I suppose just constantly question who, where, what, when, and why we're seeing that information. And then on the other side, that exercising of non-kinetic operations in a battle space, I think that's becoming increasingly prevalent as we're realizing that the operational environment is increasingly contested and congested, and Ukraine is an amazing example of this, where cyber effects, electronic warfare effects, and others can really extend or enhance the lethality of traditional kinetic effects. And I suppose the last point I would mention is that when I characterize what is a non-kinetic effect or non-kinetic operation, I'd say that it's very much non-physical and generally more reversible. I'd like to hear, Olga, what you think on that, but generally the higher level of reversibility. It might be difficult to, but generally it's not quite the same as dropping a bomb on a target per se. So high levels of reversibility, and that's generally what I would describe as a non-kinetic operation or effect. But I've canted around a few subjects there, but I wanted to really bring a little bit of context to where my headspace is at when we talk about non-kinetic operations. And I'll pause there.
Thank you, Jack. Olga, I will have actually two questions to you. The first one that Jack raised about reversibility. So imagine that like the non-kinetic operation is already started, right? The harm, certain like part of harm is done from the first second when it's launched, right? This is a goal of adversary. Is it possible to reverse it back or not? And how we practically can do this? And also, maybe I will tie this to your expertise in a Black Sea region, which is right now the tension point, right? So like the whole Black Sea region is the place where all this operation unfortunately happens. So what do you see on this example? Is it like reversible? Can we actually protect the society, if we talk about Black Sea region or any others, from the information operation, or it's unfortunately the extremely useful tool for those who attack, and much harder solution for those who want to protect?
Those are good questions. Well, a couple of things. So the Black Sea, I'll start with the end of your question. The Black Sea region right now is definitely the theater of a kinetic confrontation. And it's between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. That's one level. And then there's I always encourage people to look at this as a two-track, at least, confrontation between great powers testing each other and essentially challenging each other for power and influence globally, and then the actual confrontation between two nation states. So is this reversible? I think that in my impetus, my desire to study this has always been the motivation to understand why people do bad things and why they're tempted to use force and coercion to get what they want, and to understand human nature. Trauma, because trauma is what happened in the Black Sea and what is being used as a tool in this confrontation from a non-kinetic side of things, can be reversed. But I challenge you to look at this differently. You're dealing now with a kinetic operation, and whoever is defending in a military conflict has always more work to do than the person who has the entity that has strategic first move. So it will always be more difficult for Ukraine because Ukraine has been attacked. And can they reverse that? Of course they can, but there's too many variables. So I challenge everyone to look at this, whether it's a state, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a person, to look at this as therapy. And as a society, what do I mean by that? Therapy only works if you look at yourself, you look at what happened to you, the good and the bad, and you actually try to find mechanisms to deal with that. Because trauma is not what happened to you, but what mechanisms you have to deal with it. Some people are well equipped to do that because of their upbringing and because of the tools that they were given by their parents and community. Other people don't have that. So if we take that to the society level, it's the same mechanism. So can that be reversed? Absolutely. And I actually think Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are doing a wonderful job at that, because inside of themselves as a nation, they've decided who they want to be going forward. And that is exactly why, if we listen to the interviews given by Russian decision makers, they say that if you noticed, and I'm sure you have, they talk about the will of the Ukrainian people all the time. So can that be reversed? Absolutely. But just to be preemptive about it, I think we need to focus on what makes a country, a nation, resilient and resistant to that. And that is essentially knowing who you are, educating yourself about who you are with the good and the bad. And for a state at the state level, it's important to identify very clear political goals and strategic goals to make sure that you align them and you represent the nation that you're in charge of. So I hope I kind of answered your question a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Olga, for your perspective. It's extremely valuable. And I want to know, like, bridge it to the very much well-connected question, because we talked about the how to protect what makes, like, resilient and so on. But I believe it's also important to understand what makes the operation successful, right? Because, like, it's hard to build resilience if you don't understand what is making adversaries successful, why they are succeeding, if they succeed. And that's the questions I would address to Jack. So could you share, especially from, like, a military perspective, so from, like, operation perspective, according to your experience, what makes the information operation from adversaries successful, if they succeed? What is typical recipe for their success, so we can build a cure better?
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question, because in and of themselves, it's very uncommon, or certainly less common, for a non-kinetic operation to be delivered solely. We have examples of where that has been done, and Stuxnet is a really good example, which was almost purely a cyber operation. So it sits within that non-kinetic operation delivery. But generally what you'll find, certainly today in Ukraine, again, is testament to this, that you'll have layered effects where we're starting to deliver what is known within a military space as multi-domain operations or multi-domain integration. And this is pulling together one or two or more of the 5 operational domains. So that is land, sea, air, and the more recent ones are cyber and space. So what we're trying to do is layer some of these effects, coordinate and synchronize them temporally, so that we can, as I mentioned before, like, kind of extend or enhance the lethality of some of our kinetic effects. So they're delivered in that way. And there's a reason for this. It is because it's really expensive to deliver kinetic effects. We want to have high degrees of assurance that we know that our target is hit in the manner that we hope it is. And this is from, like, a battle damage assessment perspective, so like BDA. And it's also, some of these weapon systems are incredibly expensive. So if we can have targeted EW effects, which are going to bring down, say, air defense systems so that a missile strike can be more effective, then of course we're going to explore doing so. And some of this is also in communications, command and control. And again, this is quite an interesting perspective where we're seeing, like, the increasing use of electronic warfare or cyber, etc., where, again, if we can take down command and control systems at a time and place of our choosing, it means that we have better freedom of movement in the battlefield. So a lot of this is to set the opportunities for strategic or tactical success, and that could be, like I mentioned, a temporal component where we are having decision advantage. It could be so that we can make decisions faster, is what I mean by that. Or it could be so that we're having increased lethality or effectiveness of other systems. And then all of that starts creating what is known as the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. So if you can increase the rate and pace of your OODA loop, or slow your adversaries down, you're going to be afforded better situational awareness. You're going to get more efficient decision making, more accurate and timely decision making. And this starts almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in the battle space, where you're able to move faster than your adversary. And ultimately, that gives you maneuver advantage. And this is like a huge emphasis on initiative and mobility of force elements. So that's where I find this particularly interesting, and why we're seeing such a huge amount of effectiveness of non-kinetic operations in Ukraine, is because this is where the battle's starting to happen. As the Russian Federation and Ukraine is starting to have to lean more heavily on drone systems, or UAS, as well as dumb or non-smart munitions, for want of a better description, because they've used all their reserves of smart munitions. This is where we're getting really interesting exercising of non-kinetic operations. Again, I'll pause there because I've cantered around a few different subjects, but what I would kind of focus on here is that as we've become increasingly dependent on smart weapon systems, smart communications, data-rich environments, is why that there's so much opportunity for non-kinetic operations. If we can take away those critical advantages of a foe, then it puts us in a much more effective space to exercise our lethality.
Thank you, Jack. And I actually found extremely interesting your perspective on the connection between different domains, right? So like air, land, cyberspace. It's to some people, especially if they're not heavily connected with a defense military world, information may appear as something, you know, like living in the social media, but actually it's extremely connected with everything on the ground. Because if you want to reach result on the ground, you may not, you may want to, you know, project your perception of the world on the situation to the soldier who's in trenches, right? To achieve your goals in another domain using absolutely like cyber or informational means. Yeah,
and just a very quick reply to that is that what's really interesting, certainly within Western doctrine, is that information operations, but what you were just talking about there, influencing people across social media, etc., all comes under the same bracket of cyber operations. So again, we don't necessarily distinguish cyber and non-kinetic. Generally, you'll see it as cyber, and within that, you'll have a number of different components, one of which is information operations, which are, again, incredibly complex. I suspect Olga is a bit more of an expert on those than me, because the protracted time periods of information operations are make them so challenging, and they're less in a battle space. Things happen more quickly.
Yeah.
And whereas changing people's minds is a much more protracted time requirement.
Much longer.
And if I may just add on to this real quick, I think that we might want to take a step back and actually look at what is happening in Ukraine and has been happening in Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union, as what we love to do in the US, which is lessons learned. And if there's a few things that I've noticed and I've tried to actually learn from as I spent the last decade studying the Tsarist Russia, Soviet Union, and now the Russian Federation and the post-Soviet space, is that the way that they look at the information environment is fundamentally different than what we do in the United States, and I can say what we do a lot in NATO. So in the Russian intellectual tradition, talking about consciousness, about decision making, about societies has been happening for over 100 years now. And when we talk about kinetic and non-kinetic operations, I want to emphasize that Ukraine and NATO are two different environments, because the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian society were ready and they were they are resisting, and they are fighting against this attack on them, whether it's force, physical, or psychological. And I'm not sure that in NATO, all the nations and all societies would be ready to be in that battle. So all of these nuances are things that have changed today versus the 30s and the 40s. World War I, World War II, 1918, obviously people like to go back and say lessons learned and look at history, but I encourage everyone to look at history and to actually put the correct filter on it and to make the correct differentiation, because the human factor is very different than it was decades ago.
And Olga, actually, I wanted to ask you a very much similar question to what you started covering about the recent changes, because you're right, people often like to make references to the past, and history never repeated, it's likely to rhyme, right? So
Yeah.
what are the key changes in this? Because non-kinetic, like a propaganda usage of papers and newspapers and radio, it happened before, but what is the key changes right now? Obviously, we know the internet and all of this stuff. So I'm encouraging to maybe talk about the recent changes, like maybe last few years. What is changing right now? Maybe some changes that will affect all of us just started, and it's not visible yet, and we'll see it in the future. Share with us your perspective as a scientist on this.
I think that where I would start is we need to differentiate, because there's words matter. I say that in every single seminar or class that I teach. Words matter. Perception is built by words, sounds, and feelings, and how we feel things, all our senses, right? So when we use words, they matter. So hybridnaya vojna, everyone took that and ran, and hybrid war, but nobody really knew what Gerasimov was talking about. Essentially, what he did is he looked at how the United States operated in Iraq and post 1990, and he was trying to forecast the future. The articles were written in a sense, how should the Russian Federation armed forces prepare for future engagements on the battlefield? Where I'm going with this is information, data is different from knowledge. So this cycle of taking information through data selection, data processing, and knowledge, somewhere in there, there's education. And then there's the human factor. I go back to that because military and intelligence community is better at this, but the military in general is trying to reduce everything and to prepare, at least in the West, for a kinetic operation. They look at PSYOP and at influence operations as preparing the environment. I say, why don't we look at what Russia did well for them, because they had their own goals. I'm not saying it's good what they did. I'm just saying that they had their goals and they went about achieving them. And what Ukraine did and why Ukraine is successful. That's because culturally and in an education system, the young people of Ukraine, and on the other hand, Russia, understood these changes. So what changed? I think that the speed that the information is passed around has changed. And the impact that had is that most people don't have the background to analyze a geopolitical situation, or most people don't know when Vladimir Putin makes a declaration about the nuclear threat. Most people don't even know where the nuclear silos are for where the Russians have them. A lot of people don't know where to put on the map Kherson versus Odessa versus Kiev. So the way the speed changed and the way that it gets to the consumer, and the second thing that changed is the consumer is no longer just the armed forces. So it's the populations. And I repeat, I'm a staunch believer that we already are in a confrontation with other great powers. And the main target is populations and societies. And that reflects in the electoral process and in the way that things are happening in different countries and the choices that they make. So it's a longer term. It involves speed and it involves education. And the third thing that I think is very important is actually talking about things the way that they really are. One thing that I really enjoy with Ukrainians is that I can talk to them about Russia. And often I find myself in conversations about history, about culture, and it's happening. And that is why I think that is what contributed a lot to the strength of Ukraine. Versus if you go to Europe or the United States, these conversations, sometimes they don't happen because there's biases and then there's this prejudice. So in order to have progress and to understand what's happening, it's very important to have an honest conversation about the way things are, not the way that we want them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see already some questions and hands. We'll have a Q&A session. I encourage our attendees to write your question in a Q&A. You have a dedicated section in the kind of bottom of the screen in Zoom. Please write the question there, and then like last 10-15 minutes, depending on the amount of question, we dedicate solely to what you asked for. So please just write it there. So we talked quite a lot about what makes the non-kinetic operation successful, but I'm curious to learn why adversaries fail. So can we highlight the most typical mistakes and also as a result the most effective tools to countering this, and also and also maybe cover one failed operation that was spotted, countered, and countered effectively if you have something in mind. So maybe I will ask Jack first to address it. What do you think? Do you have something to share on this?
Sure. I think why they generally fail is not having the right cultural tone with regards to how the information operation is conducted. And I think Olga started touching on this briefly, in that landing the right message with the right sentiment is very difficult to land. Is that you can't suddenly go extreme right-wing behavior speaking to somebody who has a prevailing left-wing ideology, and vice versa, in the same way that you can't take suddenly make somebody believe in capitalism if they're very strongly against it. And what needs to happen over time is a very targeted and very well calibrated approach to changing somebody's mind over that protracted period. And if that balance is not appropriate, oftentimes we'll see the information operation will become identified because it's too obvious, or it will just fail and it won't be taken seriously. It's oftentimes where you see ambivalence or lack of engagement in certain like media lines. For example, if what we're seeing is apathy with regards to some news at the moment, because all we're seeing is very extreme news that's coming out, and that it becomes normalized, and therefore it's less effective. But if that was carefully calibrated, you could maintain and retain a much better engagement from like an audience. That's not talking about a specific scenario where I see failed information operations, but there's an example I am aware of, which is throughout North Africa, there's a huge amount of Russian presence, and some of it was around the lack of reliability of having Russia as a partner. That there was a journal, I can't remember the journalism body, but there was a media outlet that was basically talking, this was an African media outlet from Libya at the time, and they were talking about the fact that there was, don't trust Russia because they're not effective partners. And if we want to improve our relations with the West and become better off economically, is that we need to have reliable nation state partners, and maybe we should be considering that Russia isn't them. And what they did was became known in the States as memetic warfare, where they just released a series of memes of just Russian soldiers not being reliable partners. And it's quite interesting how effective that is, because it becomes a point of humor, a point of discussion, where almost like the leaflet approach, but engaging on the right sort of platform that the young people and people who are going to disseminate that are going to engage with. So there are plenty of good successes. That are not necessarily a failure, but it does undermine the operations of a nation state. So again, I'll pause there. Don't have too much to add specifically on where I've seen them fail, because they're failing all the time and we might not even know that they're happening.
Yeah, true. Olga, the floor is yours. Please share with us your perspective on the failures.
I was going to say, most of the operations we don't know about, we will never know about. And that's the thing. Are we the product? Are we not the product? Are we the subject? Are we the object? We don't know. And that's where I go back to what I said in the beginning about there's different levels of this conversation. So let's engage at the nation state level, because policy and states, are in charge of armed forces, and they have a social contract with their populations to protect them. And there's been a lot of conversations about cognitive warfare within NATO and all these attempts to manage that, which I personally think should not be done at the alliance level, should be done at the national level, but that's a whole different conversation. So the success of an operation, I think, depends a lot of what you're trying to achieve in the beginning. If it depends, if you look at it, are we talking? I'm American, so I would look at it as, what are we trying to achieve worldwide? Our success in information operations and non-kinetic operations would be, how are people perceiving us? What is our soft power? What is our reach? Are we successful in this? How reliable are we as allies and partners? How are we perceived by our foes? Are we credibly deterring them or not? Well, if you look at the way that things are going geopolitically, things have changed drastically since the Cold War, when, remember the Suez Canal crisis, that was a military success for those who attacked, but strategically it was a failure, because the United States and the Soviet Union said, wait a minute, this is not how things are going. So would that happen today? Would things be the same? We don't know, but we can all, venture to go one way or another. So a successful operation depends a lot on what you are trying to achieve. If you're trying to be, that's why I keep saying Ukraine and lessons learned is good, but that's a whole different environment than if we talk about NATO. Ukraine is fighting for their existence, and society and their armed forces are very clear what they want to achieve in defending that. So is an operation successful? It depends on the goals. If you ask me, I'll give you an example of relatively successful things that the Russian Federation and other state actors have been doing in Europe and the European Union. We've all known now that a lot of what Brexit ended up being was not created by them, but they did what they do really well. They think of the world in military maps and systems. They looked at the systems, they looked at the feedback loops, they looked at the vulnerabilities of the United Kingdom, and they maximized those. It's the same thing that they did in France, the same thing they did in Romania with the elections, the same thing they did in other countries. So were they successful? By our standards, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. For them, yes, because their ultimate goal is to create chaos and to dilute the influence and power of the United States. So it's always the filter. It's always what filter you put that through. And information operations are far more complicated because it's about people. And I'm going to sound like a broken record because I always say that. I apologize.
No, I believe it absolutely right. And no matter what kind of technologies you apply, at the end of the day, this is the people who should demonstrate well and be prepared. As by the way, like in any like a military domain, if you have the best air defense, you still need people to make the right decision in the right moment, right? I want to maybe like talk more about the technologies that should be on board for any society, for any government to counter these operations. So because anyway, like I mean, if the adversaries apply AI, apply social media, exploit current technologies that are in there should be some kind of tech response to this kind of threats. So we, from our perspective, build this kind of things to effectively analyze and spot threats and so on. But this is our perspective. And we are, like a lot into our own world where we focus on our own tasks. I would be curious to hear your broader perspective. So what kind of technologies should be onboarded by the government, by the military defense leading organizations to properly counter such operations? So maybe we'll start from Jack and then move to Olga with this question.
Okay, the particular nuance that's associated with particularly non-kinetic operations is they're so difficult to attribute. Oftentimes they're almost impossible to attribute, and there's plausible deniability. And while that's not a technical problem, there is technical nuance to that, because the capabilities that are being leveraged by adversaries and nations positions them such that they can play this national game of thrones almost, where they're influencing key political figures, they're influencing stakeholders within nations. That could just be a standard civilian that's on the electoral register, for example, and Brexit is a great example, is that what we are finding ourselves in, where there is so much information which is readily consumable by everyone, anywhere, all the time, is that too many people don't question. And that probably, to Olga's point, is not a technology problem, it is a people problem. And even when we know something is incorrect, if we've anchored on something which is incorrect, it still keeps dragging us back, and that's like almost a cognitive bias that we experience. So what could we do to improve that is exercise the same capabilities as nation states are using to deliver information operations. And that could be using AI to identify trends, or what almost of incorrect social media or incorrect news articles. And there's one thing which I recently had a discussion about, and this was like an Ofcom discussion, which was, how about we start introducing trust ratings for media outlets? Where actually is that if we know that somebody or a media outlet is just jumping on the back of what is quite a interesting or a very well sought after story, if it turns out that that was incorrect through validation, we should start reducing all of media outlets. And I think that would be a really interesting way where people know what the quality of the information they're consuming is. It doesn't need to be too quantitative. It could just be a traffic light system where, I don't know, the information you consume on TikTok should just be by default red. But if your BBC News was always traditionally believed to be quite trustworthy, therefore it could be green. But if you could improve the fidelity of that trust rating, I think it would be a technological way of helping people understand what they're viewing and whether or not it's correct information that's been validated by a trustworthy source. So yeah, it's fundamentally a people problem. Technology can help, but we've seen how much it can go awry. People's belief systems can go awry despite having access to the right information. And again, intrigued to see what Olga's got to say on this subject. It's probably much more her field within the social sciences.
I wish we had a solution, but one thing that I did notice, and I actually read an Osavul report about the Romanian elections, which was done very well. And I read obviously other reports as well about how TikTok tags and keywords were leveraged in, pushing a particular message or candidate. And I think that one of the things that we forget is that decision makers act on what they're briefed on and what intelligence is collected and how that's processed. And in addition to societies, I think as a system, as a society, and I go back again to Ukraine as an example, even the security and defense apparatus needs to modernize itself, because diversity of thought and modernizing the way you look and understanding modern technology is very important. Age gap, very important. So if the people who get this information process it and write the briefs and brief the policymakers don't understand that vantage point and the complexity of what's going on online, then there's no use of collecting all that information. So again, it's a combination of having a platform that really does a good job at synthesizing this AI social media avalanche of information on consumers. But again, we need to be careful and not go into, we cannot, because we're democracies and we believe in free speech, we cannot go online and just cut people off, because that would be censorship, and that's not what democracies do. But at the same time, we need to educate ourselves on the technology and what that does. Because I've met people in the security and defense establishments of different countries that could not tell you how a particular tag on TikTok drives a particular post to trend globally, not just locally. That's a small thing to you and me. Everyone knows that, right? Well, no, not everyone knows that. So small things like that, I think, modernizing and diversity of thought are very, very important. And that's why I think what Osavul does is very, very important, because you guys already offer the platform to do that selection that allows that analysis, if that's added on to a really sane, good, reliable human filter.
Thank you, Olga. Yeah, we try to build the tech for like friends, colleagues, and allies to solve the problem when people don't fully understand the complexity of each network and each data type. Because even if you're an advanced user, you may go to the Chinese information environment or Russian one, and the situation will be very different, or to Brazilian one or Argentinian, right? And you need to have a common denominator to operate quickly and effectively. So first of all, thank you all for answering my questions. But we have questions from the audience, and there's some really good one. So I will start asking them, and hope we can answer all of them that are in place. So the first that I see is coming from Noel. How do we handle the reality that Western societies at some distance from the direct kinetic threat, for example, UK, France, Spain, or Canada, or the United States, obviously, to counter information operations from hostile states like Russia, Iran, or PRC? Do we need a whole of society shift in mindset to accept that we are in a meaningful pre-war period, or an actual gray zone war? So this is actually good questions. How you can explain to society, and should you explain to society, that the threat is there, the non-kinetic threats are real, if the front lines, if the actual, kinetic effects, it's far away from you. Yeah, maybe Olga, maybe you will start. So what do you think on this topic?
Sure. I think that the non-kinetic operations are going on at all times, and this peace, conflict, war spectrum is a spectrum. And this is a tough one because I'm not a policymaker. I do not like to be, I like to write policy briefs, but I don't like the political side of things. But I think that it's important to talk to people, like normal communication. That's why strategic communication and communication in general from governments is essential. Because what did Volodymyr Zelensky do throughout the war? Instead of hiding, he went online, on TV, and spoke to the Ukrainian people. Amazing things happen when the people in charge communicate to their population in regular verbiage, and they say what's going on, because it helps you be prepared. And instead of panicking or making up your own stories, because you know how it is, you go into a dark room, you're tempted to think that there's, your imagination takes over, because each person has a brain, and that brain at some point goes on its own. So communicating to people and not making it about, we need to go to war with the other side. If you think of it as just explaining things the way they really are, in regular words, and confronting problems, then I think that people are far smarter than governments think that their electorate is. So communication, whether it's allies to allies, allies and partners, allies and foes, leadership to populations, very important. That's sort of like, if you look at the whole of society approach, it's like command and control, but at a whole of society. It's like any relationship, trust and communication are the two pillars.
Yeah, thank you, Olga. Jack, I will address you the same question, but I maybe rephrase it a bit. So imagine a situation when military has certain perception that there is actual conflict, maybe not a war, but conflict in a cyber domain, which is not visible on the ground, which maybe not that that clear for the a typical guy on the streets, but that's actually visible and clear for the professionals. Should the military intel community, their leaders and the government, explain to the people who are quite far away that the problem is happening, and create this sense of urgency, or it's better to do a job quietly and let people live their lives, and let defense and security people do their job? So what's your perspective on that?
I think that's a really interesting question, and generally how you will see that conversation precipitate is through regulations oftentimes. So when we recognize that there is an increasing prevalence of state-based threats through the cyber domain, what you'll see is a gradual shift, i.e. increasing security and resilience requirements from a regulatory perspective. And we are definitely seeing that, whether we talk about cyber operational resilience acts, the increasing like NIS2 from a cybersecurity perspective, where we're putting increasing pressure on particularly public organizations and financial services in the first instance to increase the security and resilience of their systems and services. Some of that is because it supports the strategic advantage for us at the nation state level, but also it's because we're starting to be a little bit more candid about the threats that we are facing every day. Separate to this, I would also say that this recognition that there's this gray zone of operational activity happening. And for me, gray zone is quite a broad concept. So many of you may be familiar with this continuum of conflict. On one side, you have competition. All states are competing with one another all the time. It's just almost a state of contestation, whether it's economically competing, politically competing, etc. You then have crisis and conflict. And on that far side, conflict is what Ukraine and Russia are experiencing right now. And one may argue that it's a conflict for Ukraine and Russia, but not a conflict to the UK directly. That means that we are still in that crisis, maybe high end of competition space. The other area that is not really spoken about is cooperation. But equally in this space, there's always activity that's happening within that gray zone because it's difficult to attribute and plausibly deniable. So I suppose that brings a little bit more context to, yes, we could be more candid as a national security intelligence community and sharing some of the threats we're under. But equally, if we were to be more over and offer more commentary around some of the awareness that we have of the threats that our adversaries are directing towards us, that's equally conceding a little bit of information advantage to our foes. So in some ways, it's like this intelligence gain-loss conundrum of how much do we share, why do we share it, and will it give us benefit if we do? So it's a really difficult balancing equation that we've got to deal with at that national security state level, where everything is macro. It's the ramifications of an attack on financial services are huge. Will those happen often? Probably not. Not unless you're in conflict. I would argue probably not. Simply because it's tit for tat escalation, where it's almost do as I do as much as anything. If we accept it from an adversary, we can do it back to them. And then it just creates this level playing field where we're all stuck in gray zone and everything becomes a gray zone activity because no one wants to escalate. We don't want to call out the adversary for doing anything bad behavior wise. So you're just stuck. Really bounced around a little bit there, but hopefully that probably conveys the message that it's really difficult. And when governments and national security organizations release information, it's because it's going to be for the greater good, as opposed to concede a potential advantage against an adversary.
But
Thank you, Jack.
Sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead, Olga, please.
Also remember that there was a gentleman called George Kennan, and he coined something that is a concept that we don't really do anymore as skillfully as we used to, which is political warfare. So governments communicating and information, passing on information, that's why I said allies, partners, foes, or populations, can be done overtly or covertly. And the way that a government communicates can be direct or indirect. So communicating and saying, doing what we did when we said that the Russian Federation will invade Ukraine and that intelligence, declassifying intelligence was instrumental because it gave the United States credit, the IC community, the intelligence community credibility, and it showed that the U.S. knows what their intelligence apparatus works very well, and that they work very well with partners. That was intelligence sharing. But often when we talk about non-kinetic stuff, it's not sharing intelligence. It's narratives. Remember, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. So things like that are also part of communicating to populations. And it goes back to for instance, in the case of the invasion, the special military operation, it was Russia had their narrative. They tried to put it out there. We all know Ruski Mir and all that. So telling the story is also part of that communication spectrum and sharing information. It's not just sharing intelligence. And if we keep thinking of war and conflict only in kinetic terms, then we've learned absolutely nothing from 100 years of engaging Russia in Europe, for instance. I think, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jackie, so much for your perspective. I think the last question was particularly tough because there is no good answer, right? So this is a gray zone question by itself because there is no like a clear solution for this equation. But thank you for your perspective, both of you, because I think it will be extremely valuable to share with our attendees. And by the result of this webinar, I see that we have almost the absolute majority of those who joined at the beginning, they stayed to the end. I think it's a good result of our communication efforts here. So maybe, the last closing word from each from you to, like one topic that anybody who came to this call should take out. Please give us, like one key point that you would like to share with the audience. Jack, please go ahead.
Oh, that's a very tough question. I wish you'd put that in some of the preparation. I don't want to steal Olga's chips, but I do genuinely believe that when we're talking about non-kinetic operations, we're talking about people. I think that I put a link in the chat to a paper that I wrote on culture as the next domain of war fighting. And I think for us, the ability to win the war without having to risk lives of people for any reason is just so important. And what we cannot keep doing is escalating to such a point where what we see as deterrence becomes another nation's escalation. And I think that's just a really dangerous downward spiral to the bottom of the barrel. But unsure if there's a solution to that problem. Is that there's always going to be bad people in the world, and we've also got to protect ourselves from them too. But yeah, not sure that there's much wisdom in that, but alas. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jack. Olga, the floor is yours. Your last closing remarks.
First of all, I did not get a preparation, but I will. That means I'll have to come back and we'll prepare that. Second, I'd go back to information to knowledge. So decision-making happens in our brain, and a lot of that is shaped in our early years. And it has a lot to do with our language, with our culture, with our community. And remembering that when we assess something, we assess it, we don't judge it. Just basic therapy, just like in basic therapy, be honest with yourself. Look at the problem as it is. Remember what you're looking to achieve. Communicate it clearly to your team and to the people that are next to you in this. Try to build trust with your allies and partners, because that's your tribe and that's who you are going to engage with, and that's who you will count on. And knowledge is a product. My knowledge will not necessarily be someone else's knowledge. And in geopolitics or in security and defense corporations, the other side, we're trying to assess it and not to judge it, to look at it as it really is, and then take it from there, rather than just assuming that the way we see the world is how the world is, because that's just perception, and it's constructed by our own experience.
Thank you so much. I think it was a really wonderful event. Before we finalize, I saw that there is actually articles and books from our panelists. So in the chat for all the attendees, you can find the link to Olga's book about foreign policy and to Jack's article. So I encourage everybody to check this out. Hope it can be a useful continuation of our conversation, and some piece of knowledge that our panelists put there could be transferred at least a bit to you, and you can make your knowledge bank a bit richer and better. Thank you so much. Thank you for the webinar, and see you next time. Have a nice day. Thank you, guys.